The press conference lights burned hot, cameras flashing like judgment, as Daniel Harris stood at the podium, palms damp, voice cracking. Headlines screamed betrayal, promising startup collapses overnight. Daniel said, "We built trust, and I failed it." Investors scowled, reporters leaned forward like vultures circling. His confidant, Sarah Blake, whispered from the front row, "Stay calm, Daniel." But his rival, Victor Steele, smirked at the chaos, knowing this was the perfect storm. The betrayal by his partner lingered like poison, every face in the crowd reflecting disbelief. Daniel's chest tightened as applause turned into murmurs. Then silence sharp enough to cut. He lowered his head, whispering to himself, "This can't be the end." The night air beyond the glass doors promised either ruin or rebirth, and he knew he'd have to choose fast. Daniel walked out of the hall into the cold night, neon signs buzzing overhead, his breath rising like smoke. Sarah hurried after him, heels tapping. Sarah said, "Don't let them see you broken." Daniel said, "That's all they saw." The city loomed indifferent, windows glowing with lives that didn't care about his ruin. A phone vibrated with new headlines. Harris Empire crumbles. Daniel shoved it back in his pocket, jaw clenched. Sarah touched his arm gently. Sarah said, "This is just chapter 1, not the last page." Daniel's silence weighed heavier than words. The apartment door slammed behind him, silence swallowing the space. Empty pizza boxes and unopened mail littered the counter. Daniel dropped his jacket, staring at the city lights through cracked blinds. He whispered, "I gave it everything." His phone buzzed again, Sarah's name glowing, but he let it ring. In the reflection of the glass, he saw the face of a man undone, not a leader. He muttered, "Maybe they were right about me." His voice cracked, but in the hollow dark, the seed of defiance stirred beneath despair. Morning light bled pale through the blinds as Sarah barged in with coffee, her energy cutting the gloom. Sarah said, "You look like hell, but I've seen worse." Daniel forced a half smile, voice hollow. Daniel said, "Funny, because I feel worse." Sarah dropped folders on the table, plans half written, dreams not yet dead. Sarah said, "You don't get to quit now." Daniel stared at the mess, anger and shame flickering, but something in her stubbornness sparked a faint flame. Later that day, Daniel walked through the empty office of his startup, chairs askew, whiteboards filled with abandoned strategies. He touched the logo on the wall, the paint peeling at the edges. He whispered, "This can't be the full story." Sarah joined him, standing shoulder to shoulder. Sarah said, "Then, write the rest of it." Daniel's chest lifted as if hope could be rebuilt from ashes. The silence of the office became less like a tomb, and more like the soil for something new. The cafe buzzed with morning chatter as Daniel Harris sat hunched over a laptop, coffee untouched, scrolling rejection emails that stacked like bricks on his chest. Sarah Blake leaned across the table, voice steady. Sarah said, "So they don't believe in you. Why do you still believe in them?" Daniel rubbed his temples, muttering, "Because they hold the keys to doors I can't open." Sarah tapped the table hard. Sarah said, "Then we build new doors." The barista shot them a curious glance, while outside, the city moved on, uncaring. Daniel sighed, the edge of defiance pushing through despair. He whispered, "If I rebuild, it has to be bigger, stronger." Sarah smiled faintly. Sarah said, "Good. Then they'll regret turning you away." Back at the office, Daniel scrawled across the whiteboard, his handwriting frantic arrows looping, words like trust, vision, and community, bold, underlined. Sarah paced, nodding, but her phone buzzed with reminders of her own obligations. Daniel said, "We can't chase investors yet, not until we prove the model." Sarah muttered, "Proving takes money we don't have." Silence thickened before Daniel slammed the marker down. Daniel said, "Then we sell what we do have, ourselves, our grit." Sarah exhaled, staring at the chaos of notes, and something like belief sparked in her eyes. Daniel visited his mentor, Charles Bennett, in a cramped library office, walls lined with business books and dust. Charles, older and weathered, raised a brow at the wreck Daniel had become. Charles said, "You've tasted failure. Good, it's the only teacher worth listening to." Daniel said, "It feels like it swallowed me whole." Charles smirked, leaning back. Charles said, "Then spit it out. Don't let it digest you." Daniel chuckled bitterly, but when Charles pushed an old leather notebook across the desk, his tone softened. Charles said, "Write your own rules. Stop playing by theirs." The advice struck like a spark in dry timber. That night, Daniel spread Charles's notebook across his apartment table. Pages blank, except for scrawled prompts. Sarah sat opposite, hair tied back, eyes scanning his sketches. Daniel said, "Every brand starts with a story. Ours needs to be stronger than their lies." Sarah replied, "People don't buy products, they buy belief." He nodded, writing furiously. Lines of strategy taking shape. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, but inside, a seed of hope grew in the dim glow. Daniel whispered, "This isn't about survival anymore. It's about proving them wrong." Days later, Daniel stood in a cramped community hall, pitching his idea to a handful of locals, his voice quivering, but eyes alight. Sarah handed out flyers, her energy relentless. Daniel said, "We're not just selling a product, we're building trust together." The room was half empty, but one older woman nodded slowly, her interest genuine. Sarah whispered, "That's one more than yesterday." Daniel smiled faintly, adrenaline humming. The start was small, imperfect, but it was a start. He thought, "If I can move one, I can move many." The community hall effort fizzled quickly, but Daniel Harris refused to quit. He sat in his dim office, stacks of unpaid bills beside him, staring at the growing gap in his bank account. Sarah Blake typed furiously, sending out cold emails to potential partners, her eyes lined with fatigue. Daniel said, "We're trying to sell belief with nothing but hope." Sarah replied, "Hope is better than silence." A call came from their landlord, voice stern about overdue rent. Daniel muttered, "They want us gone before we've begun." Sarah looked up sharply. Sarah said, "Then we fight to stay." At a cafe meeting with a skeptical investor, Daniel's voice faltered under the weight of constant rejection. The man skimmed the proposal and shook his head. Investor said, "It's too risky." Daniel said, "Everything worth doing is risky." Sarah clenched her fists under the table, fighting to stay calm. Daniel added, "You'll pass on us now, but tomorrow you'll regret it." The investor chuckled dismissively, standing to leave. Sarah whispered, "We can't keep doing this." Daniel replied, "Then we keep going until someone says yes." The rival, Victor Steele, announced his company's expansion in the same industry, making headlines that dwarfed Daniel's struggling attempt. Daniel read the article aloud bitterly. Daniel said, "He's building an empire while we're fighting to breathe." Sarah said, "Then we stop following his shadow." Daniel slammed the paper down, eyes burning. Daniel said, "He stole our ideas before, he'll do it again." Sarah answered, "Then we give him something he can't copy, us." The rivalry sharpened, no longer just about business but about survival of vision. Late at night, Daniel worked alone under the glow of his laptop, the silence punctuated only by keyboard clicks. He whispered, "There has to be a way through this." The apartment around him was dark, boxes stacked like silent critics. Sarah had already gone home, leaving notes scribbled in the margins of proposals. Daniel stared at a blank slide deck, heart pounding with self-doubt. He muttered, "Maybe they were right about me." Then, almost angrily, he added, "No, not yet." The clock ticked past 3 a.m. But Daniel's resolve burned brighter than his exhaustion. The next morning, Sarah walked into the office with coffee, stopping short at the sight of Daniel asleep on his desk, the screen filled with a nearly finished pitch deck. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. Sarah said softly, "Stubborn fool." Daniel stirred, blinking groggily. Daniel said, "I think I found our angle." Sarah set the coffee down, her expression softening. Sarah said, "Then let's make the world see it." Daniel sat up straighter, fatigue replaced by renewed fire, and whispered, "This is how we start again." Daniel Harris stood in front of a small group of potential clients in a rented co-working space, sweat prickling at his collar. His voice cracked at first but steadied as he said, "We don't just sell products, we sell belief." Sarah Blake handed out brochures, her eyes urging him on. One man yawned, unimpressed, while another leaned in, curiosity flickering. Daniel thought, "Every no brings us closer to the yes that matters." Sarah whispered, "They're listening." Daniel took a breath, lifted his chin, and pushed harder, as if the walls themselves needed convincing. Victor Steele's press conference aired on every screen in town, his booming confidence a dagger aimed at Daniel's fragile progress. Victor said, "This industry belongs to leaders, not dreamers." Daniel clenched his fists as he watched from his office, anger burning. Sarah said, "Ignore him." Daniel muttered, "He's daring me to fail." The betrayal of his former partner echoed like a fresh wound. Daniel whispered, "They left me for him." Sarah's reply cut sharp. Sarah said, "Then prove you're stronger alone." Daniel stormed into a cafe to meet an old colleague, Mark Ellis, who once believed in his vision. Mark sipped his coffee, eyes cold now. Mark said, "I can't risk my career backing you." Daniel said, "You mean you can't risk being seen with me?" Silence hung heavy before Mark left a business card behind. "I know wind E.T." Sarah later picked it up, scanning the numbers. Sarah said, "Even doubt leaves doors cracked open." Daniel thought, "But will I have the strength to push through them?" The night burned long in the office as Daniel sketched new strategies on a whiteboard, determination replacing despair. Sarah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Sarah said, "You're chasing ghosts." Daniel replied, "I'm chasing proof." The fluorescent lights hummed as ideas spilled onto paper, arrows and circles like a roadmap to redemption. Sarah walked closer, touched the marker in his hand and whispered, "Then let's make this our fight, not just yours." Daniel paused, then nodded slowly. For the first time the weight felt shared. At dawn, Daniel stood alone on the rooftop, city skyline sprawling in gold and gray. He whispered, "This is where it begins again." Sarah joined him, handing over a folder filled with new pitches. Sarah said, "Then let's give them something they can't ignore." Daniel smiled faintly, tired eyes alive with fire. He said, "They tried to bury me, but they forgot I was a seed." The city below bustled awake, indifferent yet full of possibility. For Daniel, the road was far from over, but for the first time, he could see where it might lead. Daniel Harris stood before a nearly empty room, at a trade show, the hum of larger competitors echoing down the aisles. His booth looked small beside gleaming displays, yet his voice carried conviction. Daniel said, "What we lack in size, we make up in purpose." Sarah Blake handed out samples, her smile unwavering despite the crowd's indifference. A young couple stopped to listen, curiosity sparking. Daniel thought, every giant was once ignored. Sarah whispered, "That's how it begins." The noise of rivals roared around them, but Daniel's words cut steady, like a match in the dark. Later, back at the office, the silence was broken only by the whir of a ceiling fan. Daniel slumped into a chair, exhaustion painted across his face. Sarah placed a stack of contacts on the desk. Sarah said, "We got 6 calls scheduled. That's 6 more than yesterday." Daniel rubbed his eyes, muttering, 6 against 60 rivals. Sarah leaned forward, her voice sharp. Sarah said, "We don't need 60, we need one big break." Daniel exhaled deeply, nodding, his doubt tempered by her fire. The grind felt endless, but each small victory mattered. The first scheduled call connected with a skeptical buyer. Daniel's voice trembled at first, then found rhythm. Buyer said, "Why should I trust you?" Daniel replied, "Because trust is the only thing we sell before anything else." Sarah scribbled notes furiously, mouthing encouragement. Silence stretched before the buyer finally said, "Send me details." Daniel muted the mic, grinning faintly. Daniel whispered, "That's a door cracked open." Sarah whispered back, "Now kick it wide." For the first time, hope felt tangible. Victor Steele's new ad campaign filled the city billboards, mocking smaller competitors with the slogan, "Only leaders survive." Daniel clenched his fists as he stared up at one towering sign. Sarah said, "He's baiting you." Daniel said, "He's taunting every dreamer who dares to climb." Sarah whispered, "Then climb louder." Daniel's reflection in the glass storefront nearby seemed smaller than Steele's empire, but he felt the fire in his chest swell. He muttered, "They'll know our name, one way or another." That night, Daniel gathered his small team, Sarah, 2 junior staff, and a silent but loyal intern, in the cramped office. He stood before the whiteboard, eyes burning. Daniel said, "We've been laughed at, rejected, ignored. But tomorrow, we launch on our terms." Sarah added, "This is our fight to win, not theirs to give." The team nodded, energy rising in the tiny room. Daniel looked at each face and thought, "They see me as more than a failure. They see me as a leader." For the first time, he believed it too. The morning sun crept through the tall glass windows of the boardroom, casting golden stripes across the polished mahogany table. Daniel Harris sat at the far end, his hands pressed flat against the surface as though steadying himself for battle. Across from him sat Victor Steele, immaculate in his designer suit, his smirk thin and sharp, flanked by lawyers and advisors who looked more like predators than professionals. Daniel's heart hammered, but his voice emerged steady. Daniel said, "You've tried to erase me, but today you'll see why we're still here." Sarah Blake sat just behind him, her notebook open, her eyes never leaving Victor. She whispered, "Keep your fire, but don't let him pull you off balance." Victor leaned forward, tapping his pen with casual menace. Victor said, "You're still thinking too small, Harris. Men like me decide who survives in this industry." Daniel clenched his jaw, thinking of the nights spent awake, the failures that once nearly crushed him. He said, "No. Men like you survive until people like me prove they don't need you." The room bristled with tension, every word sparking like flint in dry grass, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the explosion to come. Victor slid a glossy binder across the table, its polished cover reflecting Daniel's tense expression. Victor said, "Numbers don't lie. You're bleeding cash, while I've captured every market you dreamed of." Daniel didn't touch the binder, only glanced at Sarah, whose pen hovered over the page, ready to counter. Sarah said, "And numbers without loyalty collapse the moment trust cracks." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. Victor said, "Still clinging to morals in a world built on profit. That's why you'll always be a minor player." Daniel's lips tightened, the memory of his mentor's words echoing in his mind. "Write your own rules," he said. "You mistake patience for weakness. What you call small, we call growing roots." Victor's expression faltered, just briefly before his mask snapped back into place. Daniel felt a strange calm wash over him, realizing that for the first time, Steele wasn't laughing with confidence, but out of fear he might be losing control. The boardroom erupted as one of Victor's allies slammed his hand down, shouting, "Your company doesn't belong at this table." Daniel rose from his chair, no longer content to remain seated. Daniel said, "We belong at this table because we earned it, not because someone like Steele handed us a seat." Sarah stood too, her voice cutting through the noise. Sarah said, "You tried to bury us with lies, but the market is shifting, and people are tired of giants who don't listen." Victor's smirk wavered as murmurs spread among the gathered investors, some leaning closer, intrigued by Daniel's defiance. Daniel paced slowly, his presence commanding the room more than he'd ever thought possible. Daniel said, "We built trust while you built walls. Trust doesn't break under pressure, it multiplies." For the first time, Victor's gaze flicked toward the window, avoiding Daniel's eyes. It was a small crack in armor that had once seemed impenetrable. After the meeting, Daniel stepped onto the rooftop terrace, the city sprawling out beneath him, the air brisk with evening chill. Sarah joined him, arms folded tightly. Sarah said, "You shook him today. He's not invincible anymore." Daniel leaned against the railing, the weight of the moment pressing into his shoulders. Daniel said, "It doesn't feel like victory, not yet." Sarah tilted her head, her eyes soft but unyielding. Sarah said, "It's not about today. It's about tomorrow, seeing what you did here." Daniel's thoughts swirled with exhaustion, fear, and a strange exhilaration. He whispered, "I was always scared of him. Maybe I was scared of myself too." Sarah placed a steady hand on his arm. Sarah said, "Fear just means you're about to do something that matters." The city lights below flickered like sparks waiting for fuel, reminding Daniel that this fight was only half finished. That night, the office buzzed with renewed energy as Daniel's small team worked late into the early hours. Sarah guided junior staff, pointing at charts and reviewing slides. Daniel moved from desk to desk, encouraging, answering, reminding them that every task mattered. He said, "We're not chasing giants. We're building something giants can't touch." The intern looked up, eyes wide with admiration, saying softly, "You actually believe that, don't you?" Daniel smiled faintly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Daniel said, "Belief is contagious. Spread it until the world can't ignore us." Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, but inside, the glow of screens and the rhythm of typing felt like thunder rolling toward a storm. For the first time, Daniel could see not just survival, but a chance to win. The launch event was packed beyond expectation, the air alive with chatter, flashing cameras, and anticipation. Daniel Harris stood behind the curtain, heart pounding, every failure replaying like a film reel in his mind. Sarah Blake squeezed his hand firmly. Sarah said, "This moment is yours. Don't let fear steal it." The announcer's voice thundered his name, and Daniel stepped onto the stage, lights blinding, applause crashing over him like a wave. For a moment, he froze, memories of empty offices and unanswered calls flashing behind his eyes. Then he inhaled deeply, his voice steadying as he said, "We began with nothing but belief, and belief carried us here." The audience leaned forward, drawn in by his conviction. Daniel's eyes found Victor Steele seated near the front, his smirk gone, replaced by a furrowed brow. Daniel added, "This isn't about being the biggest. It's about being the most trusted. Today, trust wins." Applause erupted, this time not out of politeness, but because every person in the room felt the truth in his words. After the speech, Daniel unveiled the company's new product line, screens behind him lighting up with sleek designs and clear messaging. He said, "This is not just a product, it's a promise kept." Sarah narrated the presentation, walking across the stage with poise, pointing to charts that showed growth and testimonials flashing on screen. Investors scribbled notes, and murmurs of interest rippled through the crowd. One older investor leaned over to another, whispering, "This is different. This is real." Daniel caught it, a small smile touching his lips. For years he had begged to be heard. Now people were listening. Victor shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, the room's energy no longer his to control. Sarah concluded, "Trust is built in moments like these, and we're just getting started." Applause surged again, louder, unignorable, shaking the very air of the hall. In the hallway after the presentation, Daniel was surrounded by investors, shaking hands, their words full of praise. Investors said, "We want in. Where do we sign?" Another said, "You've captured something no one else has." Daniel smiled but kept his humility, saying, "We're here to grow together, not alone." Sarah beamed, scribbling down names and numbers, her eyes glowing with vindication. In the corner, Victor Steele approached, mask of composure cracking. Victor said, "Enjoy your moment, Harris. But don't forget, moments fade." Daniel looked him in the eye, calm and steady. Daniel said, "Some moments change everything, and this was one of them." Victor's silence said more than words, his retreat down the hall an unspoken concession. Sarah whispered. He knows he's lost. Daniel simply nodded, his heart light but grounded. Later that evening, Daniel and Sarah returned to the office, greeted by their small team who had watched the launch online. The room burst into cheers, papers thrown into the air, the glow of computer screens reflecting joy. Daniel raised his hands, laughing, his voice hoarse but strong. Daniel said, "This is our victory. Not mine, not hers, but ours." Sarah added, "Every late night, every rejection, every doubt led to this." The intern, wide-eyed, whispered, "We were really part of something bigger." Daniel walked to the whiteboard still covered in scribbles of past plans, and tapped it. Daniel said, "This is where we started, and today proves that even the smallest lines can grow into something unforgettable." The team erupted again, their voices filling the tiny office with a sound far greater than its size. As midnight approached, Daniel slipped out of the office and stood alone on the balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. He whispered, "From nothing to this." Sarah joined quietly, handing him a coffee, her voice soft. Sarah said, "You built more than a business, you built belief." Daniel sipped slowly, his eyes scanning the skyline, thinking of every sleepless night, every betrayal, every whispered doubt. He said, "It wasn't about being a household name. It was about proving to myself that I was never broken beyond repair." Sarah smiled faintly, resting her hand on his shoulder. Sarah said, "And now the world sees what I've always seen." Daniel exhaled, the weight of the journey lifting at last. He whispered, "Tomorrow, the fight begins again. But tonight, we've won." The camera of the world seemed to pull back, the image of two figures silhouetted against glowing towers burning into memory.